Hamitakapi, thanks for joining us. This is Nick Estes, co-host of the Red Nation Podcast. We have some special guests today. Some comrades from the Democratic Socialists of America are joining the podcast today to have what's hopefully a frank and free-flowing discussion about the direction of the organization and building, a socialist movement in the United States, what that means, facing a variety of different sort of challenges right now, but also opportunities. So without further ado, I'll just start in the order of the panel. But we have Jorge, John, and Luisa. Maybe we'll start with you, Jorge, if you want to just introduce yourself and your position that you hold in DSA.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick, and thank you for having me on. My name is Jorge Rocha. I am the co-chair of DSA's International Committee since 2023. I've been a member of the organization since 2019. And previously I've served as in various leadership positions in the NYC DSA chapter, which is the chapter that I've been a member of for the entirety of the time I've been in DSA. Thank you for having us.
And I'll turn it over to John. You want to introduce yourself and what position you hold in the DSA?
Hello, my name is John. I use he, him pronouns. I serve on DSA's steering committee. Served on DSA steering committee since 2023. I'm currently our national treasurer and serve alongside Luisa. Glad to be here.
And then last but not least, Comrade Luisa.
Thanks, Nick. My name is Luisa, she, her pronouns. A member of DSA since 2017, 2018, something like that. I have served on the IC along with Jorge, and now I am part of DSA national leadership along with John.
And for those of you who can't see, Luisa is holding the smallest microphone in the world. So there's a lot to talk about, but I want to just start by talking about the most recent DSA convention that happened earlier, a couple weeks ago. And there was a lot of sort of rumbling online. We were just kind of having a pre-conversation. From my perspective, following folks online, it seemed as if there were a lot of important victories that happened in terms of decisions and votes that came onto the convention floor. And I was wondering if one of you wanted to maybe just start by listing off some of the major sort of votes that took place and sort of the outcomes of them. I think one of them was the DSA taking the direction of forming a party. So maybe one of you can take that and explain what that vote was and the outcome of it.
Yeah, sure. I can hop in here. So it's kind of building on a trend that's been going on since our 2021 convention. DSA has national conventions every 2 years. And, essentially what our convention is, we get delegates from all of the chapters and the at-large members across the country. We come together and we basically have a big meeting where we do our democracy and make decisions. And so pretty much there's been a consistent trend the last 3 conventions now, since this one has passed, where we've been kind of going down this process of pushing towards building an independent socialist party in this country, right? And so one of the major things in relation to this is that in 2023, we passed a resolution called Act Like an Independent Party that was specifically, and I'll shout out our international comrades here from Morena, Partidos dos Trabalhadores, or Partidos Socialismo y Liberdad in Brazil, and or we mentioned Die Linke in Germany as well, and a couple others, where essentially we want to try to really build that brand of DSA to become an independent party, an independent socialist party. And so what we did at this convention was a lot of things that followed the line of that, where we're talking more about running candidates independent from the Democratic Party line, running on essentially more independent lines, trying to prioritize running independent candidates, and also doing this across all levels, and also trying to more closely and tightly integrate our interactions with our elected officials from federal level all the way down to local level, and not doing any more what we call paper endorsements.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. Do either of Jorge or Luisa want to add to that?
Not necessarily about that one. I'm happy to talk about the anti-Zionism resolution, though, if you're ready for that.
Yeah, for sure. We have a question actually for that, and I think this is what has gotten the sort of most media attention. So yeah, if you want to talk about the anti-Zionist policy, what it is, what it isn't, and yeah, how that vote went, how that vote and debate came about.
Yeah, for sure. So anti-Zionism resolution basically says that, it's the first time that the organization has had electoral standards, right? In terms of having been voted on in convention, and then it's something that will be ideally upheld by the MPC. And so, I struggle to understand some of the right-wing criticisms of the resolution, because it's basically saying if you provide material support for genocide for Israel, if you are anti-BDS, we won't support you as an organization, right? I think some of the criticism is that that's an ultra kind of position to take, but the vast majority of people at convention voted for it. It did pass overwhelmingly, at least by DSA standards. It was almost at 60%. And so it says that we draw the line at genocide, right? So if you're an elected official and you vote for Iron Dome, or you are anti-BDS, you will no longer get the support of DSA. And so there was a number of things that went into that. One was 2 years of organizing so that chapters passed at least some form of anti-Zionism resolution, so that electeds would be held accountable for when they did do things like that. So 2 years of organizing to pass that at the chapter level, in addition to, of course, the terrible violence that we've seen coming out of the region against Palestinians. And so it was probably it was a combination of those two things that made it clear for a majority of members in DSA to say, this is where we're going to draw the line. And so it was something that we had tried to do the convention before that, and it didn't even get onto the agenda, versus this time where it passed overwhelmingly. I don't know if Jorge wants to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of what Luisa just mentioned is important that we keep in mind. DSA is an organization with a multitude of different opinions. I mean, even there's a lot of discussion that's happened in the internet and also various different socialist circles as well as activist circles about, say, for example, the body that I preside over, the International Committee, in terms of its supposed aberrant opinions that's held in the organization. For the most part, this is not true. There are a multitude of different opinions. I mean, at the very least, for those of us who are on this call, we represent what is broadly viewed as the quote unquote left of the organization. But even within that, there's a difference of opinion in terms of tactics and strategies. I mean, ultimately, people need to reckon if DSA is a political organization with the intent and ambitions to wanting to build a political party. And there's a very broad intent of what is viewed as democratic socialism. And I think that that's something that we always have to always have in the front of our minds in terms of discussions that are relevant in terms of the internal dynamics within DSA. The reason I mention that is, as Luisa mentioned, in terms of the anti-Zionist resolution, this is the first time that there are any standards that have been implemented, or at the very least, the ambition to implement at the national level with respect to any political position whatsoever. This is uncharted territory for DSA, and this is something that we must keep in mind, and also for your audience, and for anyone that is interested or at least observing DSA in terms of how it maneuvers and engages in politics, must always have in their mind, because we are trying to figure this out as much as anybody. So I think this is something that, be sure to have at least some grace in terms of that. But I think what also must be reckoned with is the decentralized nature of DSA as it's currently structured. The national organization is one entity, and of which there are 200 affiliates of these local chapters that are in various different localities, regions, and areas in the United States. So it's going to be a learning process in terms of trying to consolidate, as well as and have a much more coherent ideological position as with respect to both anti-Zionism, but also other things. From my point of view, I do not view this as the end, but rather the beginning of a new orientation towards socialist politics.
Yeah, thanks so much for that answer, Jorge and Luisa. Yeah, there was a lot of sort of chatter online about what that meant. But real quickly, because for those of you who don't know, every time I hear this word, I kind of cringe. But does somebody want to just define what ultra means? Because I didn't know that this was something that was actually thrown around in DSA spaces. But yeah, if you want to define what ultra means, because I kind of see it it's an accusation, it's an analytic, but yeah, if somebody wants to just quickly say what that means real quick.
I can hop in real quick.
So I think Denki was like do niche of a term. And so I think it just moved from Denki. I don't know. You're asking a very important sociological question. I have no idea. So I assume it comes from Denki. Denki was too narrow, which is, of course, like refers to the Soviet Union's rolling tanks into Hungary, and that being anyway. And then it just moved to ultra, which is like basically anything, I would guess, that is such a left position that it's isolating towards like normies or liberals or people on the cusp, where we would kind of get in our own way in terms of appealing to the, appealing to the masses, right? There's always this idea, there's like the perfect worker, right? Like we need to learn how to appeal to the perfect white worker in the United States. And so, but what I find what's so interesting is that the resolution passed. So if most delegates voted for it, like how is that in any way ultra democratic or marginal, right? If most people, especially when it wasn't even on the agenda, we had tried to get it on the agenda last convention. And as I said before, there's like 50 some chapters. I'm trying to remember that passed some form of AZ. So I feel like folks who voted against it are probably, it's a tough situation to be in, because what you're basically saying is that I don't know what accountability towards electeds looks like for those people, right? And if genocide is not the line that we draw, what the fuck is it then? Like how bad do things have to be to where we're finally like, no, you're not going to get our support as an organization?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Comrade Luisa mentioned. I think also we have to keep in mind two components in terms of trying to arrive at a definition as to what ultra means. One is its origins theoretically have with the text by Lenin on ultra leftism, right, on quote unquote left wing communism and infantile disorder. This, I think, is a text that's been extremely misinterpreted. As in, people will read a text and try to quote it to back up their position, which, this is something that everybody does for the most part, but there is a way of doing so that is part of a larger theoretical contribution, as opposed to simply reflecting and citing something that previously already exists to be the case. So for us to be able to interrogate why is it that in the context of DSA and in the context of elected accountability, as well as membership accountability, to cite a position of anti-Zionism explicitly referencing the Tawhid principles, which is the consensus fundamental principles of the Arab liberation movement as respect to Palestine, I think it behooves us to have a better understanding that perhaps it is not simply to dismiss, although that's definitely the intent of maybe some people, but really a disagreement on theory of change, right? And this is tied to the second reason, also them using the word ultra as opposed to using ultra left, right? Ultra in the context of sports, particularly football, has a very specific definition of very loud fans. And so the fusion of these two terms, as well as the theoretical backing of that, is to suggest that anyone that is criticizing an elected is an ultra. I view this as a very consistent, insult to use against a lot of us that are in our camp. And ultimately, I think, is because of what Luisa said, that there is not a full understanding as to what elected accountability is. And I think it is related to how, if you look at the development of social forces and anti-systemic movements all over the world and historically, there are basically two choices. Either the elected lead that movement, right, or the party does. And this is a very important question. And I think this is intimately tied to what you asked earlier, Nick, about the decision to build a party, right? If you're deciding to build a party and you're deciding to start enforcing accountability, then it's very clear what direction the membership of DSA is leaning towards.
Yeah, John, did you want to chime in there?
Yeah, I think Luisa and Jorge really covered a majority of it, and I'd build on that a little bit though, and say that I'd also throw in, right, that you have this situation where you have people who do have ties to these electeds too, right? This is essentially part of where people derive their income, their rent, their careers, their jobs, etc. from that. And so there is also kind of this hinge tin of where it's my job, my rent, my healthcare depends on this person staying elected. And with just the general current of politics in the country between fascism and progressive neoliberalism, progressive neoliberalism will continue to pay their bills. And so it's when you talk about elected accountability, when you talk about these things of trying to push political messages that are counter to those mainstream politics in the US, then you kind of run up against these forces where it's these folks are well, I'm not sure. I'm nervous. This is too risky for me. And I'm this is a situation where we are either trying to build a political current that is trying to change people's lives, change the society, change the world, or we're not, right? And so I just wanted to build on that because I think Jorge set it up excellently.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that clarification. I would just, also just emphasize some of the things you said is that it's trying to marginalize what is a majority position in DSA. And I think also, something I'll just confess a little bit of naivete about is I didn't fully understand, and I've gained a lot more appreciation for the sort of political machinery that goes into making DSA, in the sense that there's a ground game at work in terms of getting out. A lot of people are canvassing for voting or policy initiatives. Like here in this city, it's election season for city council. And I think there's only one independent DSA endorsed socialist candidate, Robin Wansley. And there's a massive DSA ground game, that supports her. And, you have other sort of Democrat aligned candidates and whatnot. But I think people maybe think that DSA is just passing policy as if it's, kind of making these things up in the air as it goes along, but it's actually responding to, I guess, the way I see it is responding to a sort of grassroots, electoral campaigns, but also canvassing that happens, which gets me into my next question, because DSA isn't just about electoral politics. It also has a pretty heavy footprint in labor organizing. And there was another a resolution that was passed about striking for an arms embargo. I'll turn it over if somebody wants to answer that question or clarify that particular vote.
So I don't know, Jorge, I know you've done some work on this. I could speak to it, but I don't know if you want to go first.
Sure, I could do it. Yes, so in terms of the Labor for Arms Embargo resolution, this has its origins in the Labor Commission for the national organization, and its intent is to build a complementary parallel campaign that is targeting Maersk. And the important aspect of this is, and some of the historical context is, until the anti-Zionist resolution was passed, the host organization of which this campaign had its origins from, the Palestinian Youth Movement, or PYM, was boycotting the national organization. And so there was a growth in terms of interpersonal relationships that PYM trusted particular individuals in the National Labor Commission to carry that work forward. but also effectively recommended, which also has happened at a local level and various places. That if you wish to take this campaign, you may do so. There's nothing stopping you from targeting Merck on your own. You just have to take it. You have to take it up on your own and make it DSA's own campaign, which is important to clarify, and also the immediate context politically in terms of why is it that it's similar to the PYM campaign, but is of a different character. And so I wanted to mention that, but also, and I think this also has to do with the growth of how DSA has developed itself, meaning that a lot of the work that DSA members are engaged with in terms of campaigns or different initiatives are primarily at this juncture siloed off in terms of particular sectors of organizing. And so because it is, even though one may view this as why it is not under, say, the International Committee, right? The reality of the case is that if people are engaged with labor organizing, then at the point of production of which these members are engaged in, then this is the origins of that campaign. And so this, I think, is part of and related to what I said earlier in terms of the decentralized nature of that campaign. But I would like Luisa to continue this conversation since I know she has much more understanding of the particulars here.
No, I'll just give kind of a basic breakdown. So, labor for an arms embargo, it's just this idea that we would organize, that labor would be a part of it, right? Part of the resistance. And organizing labor to understand how unions touch the supply chain of genocide and how we can materially impact it as an organization. And of course, as DSA labor. And so Maersk is one of the, is part of that chain. Weapons manufacturers, their source materials are particularly at a target. And what a lot of people don't understand about it is that, they use civil infrastructure in order to transport these source materials, right? So like at the end of the day, what is the difference between a bullet versus a bullet casing versus, all the parts that go into building the death machine that the United States makes a ton of money off of. And so people are not, there's a general lack of awareness that the civil infrastructure is used as a way of shipping these death machines. There's a warehouse in New Jersey. Dock workers are a part of the supply chain. Port Elizabeth is a lot of where these weapons are shipped out of. Weapons are also flown out of JFK in commercial passenger planes. A lot of people are not aware of that people fly with these weapons on board. And so the idea was engaging labor, right? And then also creating awareness of how these supply chains work.
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess I want to kind of return to another question that you started talking about earlier, because I guess some of what you read online, and I don't know oftentimes how effective it is to just read some of these criticisms, because are they coming from a genuine place? But I think it was Jorge had mentioned how there's a sort of idea of a universal worker that has to be appealed to, or a universal sort of American, right? And I guess like just in my own proximity, I can only speak for myself, but the community from which I come and the people like that I come from and, call my relatives and my neighbors, are typically not having these conversations around whether, supporting a genocide will divide the community, because there seems to be overwhelming moral condemnation of what has happened. So I guess like for me, thinking about the successes within DSA at the convention to get these majority votes, I really want to know like who makes up the membership of the DSA, because I'll just be frank, and I told you guys I wasn't going to name names, but I'll just name names. Like sometimes when I read Jacobin, I just don't see reflected the kind of voices and people that I see organizing in DSA, who are doing the groundwork, who are doing political education, who are talking about the issues that you're talking about. So who are these? Who is this majority of DSA members who are voting for these kinds of things? And I know like there's a relationship with Jacobin is not necessarily the official mouthpiece of the DSA, but oftentimes it kind of stands in for many people in terms of how they interact. So yeah, I just wanted to ask you guys, like, who is your membership? I mean, you all are coming from different regions of the country. Maybe you can just give people an idea of the kinds of people who vote for these kinds of things and why people join DSA and get involved in these organizing campaigns.
Yeah, I'll hop in here and I'll say that. So just like you mentioned, right? Like heard a lot of different things about like class character, all types of things about it. But the key thing is that because DSA is structured as a mass organization, like anybody can just go to the join link and just join at any point in time, just like I did, right? Like I learned about socialism. It aligned with my background. It aligned with my anti-poverty organizing and the stuff I've been doing in Louisiana beforehand. And so it just made sense for me in that case to like find a socialist organization and join it. And so pretty much, but I wasn't yet a socialist, right? Like I knew I wanted to be a socialist. I needed to go through political education, organizing, and struggle with comrades to become a socialist, right? And so I would say that like a majority of the folks who join DSA fall within that gamut of like folks who are interested in socialism, but not yet socialists, and will typically become socialists through their organizing, development, and participation in a socialist org. I would throw in on top of that and say that like, as far as who's joined DSA, what are like demographics, what the backgrounds look like, I would say from what I've looked at recently, about a good 1/3 of our membership joins in the last year and more, and it's been ticking up higher and higher, is about a little under half of them are non-white people. And so like we have people from all over the place, all over the country, including from Hawaii to Alaska to Maine, Connecticut, the Deep South, just helped get a chapter reestablished in Jackson, Mississippi. We have folks everywhere. We have folks from all types of backgrounds, all types of things that they think about. But I would say the key thing about it with DSA being a democratic organization is that pretty much like I would say directly our identities, right? The way our society interacts with us, where we come from, where we grew up at, who we're around, the things that we experience, where we have these breaking points with this capitalist death machine, as I will call it directly, are the things that kind of become those focal points that then influence our politics outwards from there. And so through the democratic process and political struggle within the organization is then shaped by these perspectives, right? Like I helped shape the organization from my perspective as pretty much a Black person who grew up organizing in the Deep South in Louisiana, right? Whose friend was murdered by the police, who's had multiple friends be accosted and immediate family members. I've watched them get beat by the police, right? So like those are things that deeply shape it. And before I hand it off to someone else, I'll also throw in that, yeah, like I'm so very glad that we got our internal magazine and journal, Democratic Left back up and Socialist Forum back up, because you can see a much wider breadth of opinions, ideas, and things put forward there in comparison to the line that Jacobin typically has.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think our support, passing anti-Zionism resolution and all the work that went, the years of work that went into it, definitely helps shaped the organization and who has joined in the last 2 years. I will just say, like, I think that there is a criticism of DSA being a white organization. I'm actually less convinced about that. What stands out to me more than anything is, I would say, probably the class composition. That like people would read Jacobin, and like I'm not sure. At the end of the day, we're having a conversation about our comrades, right? Like we're all members of the organization, so I don't want to be too critical, right? But I would say that like what you read, for instance, does represent a certain part of the organization, right? But at the end of the day, ultimately, we have a convention every 2 years, and we vote on stuff like this. So, they're welcome to write opinion pieces, but ultimately, I think a good way of understanding how the organization works and what our political positions are looking at what comes out of that convention. And so, for me, like there are moments in the organization, I grew up with a lot of, I grew up below the poverty line, poor, undocumented immigrants. There are times where I feel frustrated, right? I'm an internationalist within the organization. But ultimately, right, I have to respect in terms of what gets voted on. I'm a labor person. I'm a full-time union organizer. Like, I have to respect, if a vote goes my way and I don't like it, so be it. That's kind of part of the joy of DSA, is understanding that we are a democratic organization, and that's what we do. We get together and vote. We have debate, and ultimately we vote. So I would say the vast majority of people in DSA understand that.
Yeah, and if I may jump in, I agree with so much of what both John and Luisa mentioned. And I think to kind of step back and think about why, as Luisa mentioned, there's a certain class composition of membership, and why perhaps there's a bit of a shift in the newer membership that are coming in. And the reason I say it's like a shift, because I guess it's going without saying that the class composition that we're referencing is the traditional professional middle class in the United States. And this has a lot to do with our analysis of the national question, meaning that what is the composition of people that live in the United States, the wealth, the capital accumulation that the U.S. has engaged in terms of being involved with imperialism on a world scale, right? And it's the wealthiest country that has ever existed in human history. It shouldn't be surprising, at least from our point of view, that that even if there is a working class in that country, it is one that is far wealthier than any other working class in the world. And this isn't necessarily a conversation about that there shouldn't be labor struggle. There absolutely should be, right? But rather that labor composition in the United States is one that is on the world scale, a labor aristocracy. And especially, but this isn't to suggest that all workers in the core in the United States are of this aristocracy. In fact, if we step back and think about, well, then who is the proletariat of the United States? It's typically, although not always, Black, brown, indigenous, people who are working manual labor, many times undocumented, right? That are running the society and doing the manual labor that is not interested, and there is actually serious exploitation that's occurring. This isn't to suggest that someone who is, PMC or whatever term you wish to describe these people, who have typically white collar jobs paid comparatively better than blue collar workers, that have the flexibility to work from home, who are able to get on live streams like this one, and also have college education, are typically people who are of European descent. And this has everything to do with the development of how the United States is a settler state, has origins from European colonization of the Americas, right? This is something that when you bring up can make people very uncomfortable, but we do have to talk about it, because if we don't talk about it, then we're just flattening contradictions. And if we are Marxists, then that is actually the death of scientific socialism, right? And so we have to be very frank and honest about that, right? And so when there's political struggle, in terms of back to the Jacobin magazine, there's certain people who have certain positions. Therefore, they want to broadcast those positions and wish to change people's opinions and bring them to their position. This is just how politics work. But Jacobin does not speak for the entire organization. It probably speaks at most maybe a third of the cadre, of which is a small section of the membership. And what I'm describing right now is the overwhelming majority of very active, politically committed socialists within DSA, who have very different opinions and different theories of change, who we very broadly, although we do not have any official designation or articulation as to what that means, we call cadre, are a much smaller segment of the membership. I would say probably maybe 2,000, maybe 5,000. It's in that general range, but I would not say more than 10-15% of the membership. The vast majority of the membership are paper members. This is a very important question that many people have different answers to. That is not very clear why there is a large paper membership that is not as active. But what is true is who are the new membership that comes in, right? If the theory of change that DSA occupied before, say, 2015, and also some reverberations of that continuing into 2020, 2021, was of a majoritarian politics, which is different than mass politics. We have to designate that. Majoritarian position being the position to win politics of the majority of the population at that moment in time. Some may argue that that is taylorism. What is clear is that is distinct than, say, talking about mass politics, which millions of people is still mass politics, even though it is not the majority. And so what are the mass politics that inhabit the US today that are aligned with revolutionary socialist objectives? Well, the first and foremost is anti-Zionist, right? An anti-Zionist position is mass politics in the United States, and it's growing more and more in that sense. Who are those who are interested in and adhering to an anti-Zionist position? For the most part, are people who have a much stronger understanding of settler colonialism, which typically are not European, people who have European descent.
Thank you, all three, for that. Those wonderful answers to these questions. I mean, different in important ways, but also the same or similar in important ways. And I think what each of you described in terms of, in various ways, is that you're talking about like working class experiences in the United States. I think typically people don't really assume that like anti-Black racism in the Deep South is a working class issue, but it is if you're a Black person in the South, even if you're a white person in the South, right? And I think Jorge hit the nail on the head, so to speak, was saying that these are uncomfortable conversations, and anybody who's canvassed, anyone who's had a union conversation on a job site knows that these conversations can be uncomfortable because you're engaging with people as they are, and so it shouldn't be unexpected or surprising that when you're in an organization and you're talking about things like genocide, removal, histories and legacies of slavery, the ongoing mass attacks against migrants in our communities, that people are going to be uncomfortable with that, or like, whether your family or the person you voted for is supporting, a 21st century genocide being live streamed to our phones. Like, politics is not a place for people to, it's not like, I try not to be dismissive, but sometimes I think people feel like we have to handle people with kid gloves. And in fact, I think the way that we're seeing, inflation affect everybody across the board. People can't afford, basic groceries. I just saw in the news that mortgage foreclosures in St. Paul, which is the neighboring city to Minneapolis, like doubled just this year, not even counting the whole data for the entire year. And there isn't much, panic in terms of like the ruling class. They're outsourcing all the contradictions to everybody else, right? And of course, we know the most marginalized sector of society experiences the most violence in terms of ICE raids, in terms of violence from the state, in terms of housing precarity, et cetera, et cetera. So these are, I think, as you said, like, these aren't this isn't about feeling good and doing kumbaya. This is about actually challenging deeply held and defended beliefs. Whether it's white supremacy, whether it's genocide, etc. But these are, I think, as I'm hearing you all say, these are deeply working class politics. And this, turns me to, I guess, the final kind of question I have around the current initiatives and campaigns. It's kind of a double question, so maybe I'll ask it in two parts. The first is, how is the DSA mobilizing against this, I hate to use this word, unprecedented attack? It's not even really unprecedented. It's an intensified attack on migrant communities and racialized communities, using ICE, using the Department of Homeland Security, all these various federal agencies to come into cities like Chicago, Portland, LA, to basically terrorize local populations. How on a national and local level is DSA responding to this attack?
Well, I can attempt to go first. So for one thing, when you talk about issues that in some circles are maybe not within the purview of like this perfect worker, right? Stuff like immigration or Palestine, U.S. foreign policy, imperialism, etc. Our take was our take with it during convention is that these issues are now becoming inevitable to have to deal with, right? So like immigration and Palestine are excellent examples in that Palestine a couple of years ago, it's like, well, what does that have to do? What does that have to do with like the day-to-day reality of like, this perfect worker, right? When now you do have labor passing resolutions, right? Demanding a ceasefire. I can tell you NEA, right? The National Education Association, all the non-management workers in a public school, they had their national convention. They passed a resolution distancing themselves, saying that, that NEA would no longer use resources by the Anti-Defamation League, right? That was knocked down at the executive level, right? For the National E-Board for a bunch of like legal reasons. And so an organization that, like NEA, right, which typically does not take any kind of controversial political positions, now they're having to confront, right, the Palestine question. And so now, obviously, in terms of what we're seeing, the scapegoating of undocumented immigrants for years and years by the right wing, now we're seeing the byproduct of that. And so just kind of connecting what you said last, Nick, about that these are working class issues, we can finally see that, yeah, we don't have a choice but to deal with these things. I am part of the Portland, Oregon chapter. So we, so one of the things that we did was have an emergency meeting, right? I'm a part of the immigrant justice organizing here, organizing, Migra Watch. We've been doing prior to Trump attempting to invade Portland. We were doing lots of Know Your Rights workshops for immigrant families, right? That was one of the things that we did. And yeah, just basically being on alert, and then for more than anything, trying to stop deportations. And you do that by educating people in terms of what their rights are. A lot of people who are born here, who are citizens, don't understand their rights, right? When it comes to police, right? When it comes to, when they're stopped. So using that, providing that as a resource to the undocumented community, that's how you actually stop deportations, right? Making people understand to, shut the fuck up and don't open the door. It's like a really big key. Taking it back to convention, we did we did pass Fight Fascist State Repression and ICE, the Abolish ICE. And so we connected the idea of abolition, right, with, abolishing ICE, which is not an organization that has existed for very long, right? ICE would barely be able to, the Department of Homeland Security would like barely be able to buy a beer, right? If it went to just past the age to be able to buy a beer. So at a bar. And so understanding that these are, at least when it comes to immigration enforcement on the scale that we are seeing, is a relatively new thing. And that ultimately it goes to the privatized prison corporations, right? That at some point in the 90s, they saw that there was a downturn, that there was less and less people being sent to jail. And so they didn't want to lose any money. And so they came up with this, the detention center racket, basically, to try to fill beds, right? So understanding that the fight for abolition and the fight to abolish ICE are absolutely intrinsic and materialist fights, and having a socialist understanding as well. So that's something that, there's lots of NGOs, right, and community organizations. There's probably thousands across the United States, especially now, doing this work. But in terms of what DSA can do as an organization, and the difference that we can make, is making sure that people understand the material analysis, the socialist analysis of why these things are happening, right? And then, of course, getting opportunities to get involved. I don't know, John, if you want to say anything about the national level, or Jorge.
can hop in real quick and say, I mean, Luisa covers so much of it excellently there, but I would say the other parts of it, right, is that if you can take like information that we get from DC, Chicago, LA, and do cross trainings, like we have a lot of chapters that are requesting cross trainings on different things. So like at the national level, a lot of it really looks like trying to find ways to like connect the organizers, connect the things that they're doing, and bring those things together, just like Luisa was talking about a bit there. I'd also throw in too, on top of that, is like, it goes about like finding ways to basically, like, when you think about organizing at such a high level, it's kind of like, how do you bring these folks together? How do you share resources? How do you share information? How do you share strategies? How do you coordinate with folks? And how do you prep folks? Like when people were talking about, oh, hey, they're not just going to hit DC and LA. Now they're going to Memphis. Now they're going to Chicago. Now they're coming to New Orleans. Now they're going to Portland, et cetera, right? Like, how do we connect with the chapter leaders? How do we connect people with the movements there? And how do we get folks ready for that is some of the things alongside, thinking about ways on like how to train folks, how to spread all of those things in relation to it, get that distributed out. I would say those are some of the big things there, alongside also thinking about ways that we can kind of coordinate this across, like, how do we bring in labor into this? How do we bring our electoral sphere into this? How do we bring our mutual aid and survival programs into this as well? You know, like, what are the different ways that we can kind of think about a way to like approach these?
Jorge, did you want to respond or? Okay. Yeah. So I guess the kind of penultimate or the final question, the ultimate question here. I know that we kind of opened a Pandora's box on some of these questions, reading the comments and people's responses. Some of them, very, responding kind of like either, really supportive or somewhat critical. This is a good discussion. I think it's a debate that needs to keep happening and keep moving forward. And, one of the things that's happening right now, I think if there's any organization that's named in this recent slew of, executive orders, national security briefs and memos, it's this Antifa, right? Or anti-fascism. I think adjacent to that would be the Democratic Socialists of America. I mean, Antifa is, it's a boogeyman. It's a straw man. It's the new red menace, right, so to speak. And typically the right, even liberals, kind of invoke the red menace or the specter of communism, in this case anti-fascism, as a way to define the enemy, right? And the enemy here is the left. And I want to kind of maybe have a conversation about how DSA is responding to this. I mean, on one hand, it's like you're the most recognizable organization out there in terms of like just name recognition. You're coming out of I don't know if Trump has ever said your name out loud, but I know that some of his lackeys have. And so how a lot of us are it's a little bit different when you're a political organization versus a nonprofit, because we kind of see nonprofits really kind of stepping back a little bit and being more risk averse. Because of the tightening of budgets, the clawing back of federal funding for certain things. You see the attack on universities, and this, in some ways, it's like nonprofits existed for a long time as for a variety of reasons. They did good things, but also they kind of participated in counterinsurgency and demobilizing, defanging, and blunting sort of the more radical edge of the working class. But at the same time, this is kind of, the socialists in particular, communists and anarchists, who could put them all together, play a really important role in sort of galvanizing working class issues and organizing in moments of crisis, right? And when you have a democratic kind of party that sort of lays down in the face of fascism, or picks up a gun and sits, shoulder to shoulder with fascism to fight the perceived enemy, that is the left, you're kind of put in this situation where it's like there's only one thing, you are the only alternative that many people are turning to. So how are you confronting that political reality in this situation, in this sort of national climate? There are other groups. I'm not just saying like the DSA is the best and whatever, or like the Vanguard Party. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's the most recognizable, at least to this administration, in terms of you have the most numbers. You've successfully won electoral and campaign initiatives. So yeah, I kind of want to hear your thoughts on that, because it seems like a very critical moment, but at the same time, I mean, just speaking from experience, I feel like the DSA that I know in this area has really come together more than other groups, more than the nonprofits, has stepped forward and has started kind of strategizing and saying, hey, we need to do something about this.
I'll hop in directly and say that the number one thing that we're doing right now is that, like, we are not going to stop organizing in the face of fascism, period. Right? Like, that is one of the number one things that we have been consistent about. Just like you mentioned about the lackeys mentioning us, people sending letters, other things like that. Like, we're going to continue doing what we need to do to get organizing, to get working class people organized, so that way they can stand up for themselves and also fight back. I'll also throw in too that there are specific things about the way that our organization is structured. Even if you look back at, like, the history of, like, how McCarthyism and even how they're challenging nonprofits and other socialist organizations today, right? Like, DSA is entirely funded by its members. So there is no string that they can pull. There is no rope that they can cut. There is nothing that they can yank back from us or any billionaire that they can target or go after. No grants, none of that. The other thing about it specifically is that DSA is completely led and organized by its members. We are the collective. We are the force. We are the thing that exists and pushes forward on that. I'm going to shout this out to fuck ICE, free Palestine, free Congo, free Sudan, and land back. But I'll also throw in there specifically, right, that, like, when it comes to it, that, like, we are led by our members. Like, just like myself and Luisa are elected, Jorge is also elected as he leads our international work too. And so it's like we elect our members, we put them forward, we put them in positions to help the rest of us carry these things forward. So I would say that before the big thing forward, before I know they're gonna throw in on this too, is that, like, we're going to continue organizing and we're going to continue trying to find ways to allow people to continue to do that, to protect their communities, and also organize the working class that we need to do what's next.
Yeah, I agree with so much of what John just mentioned. It does not, just because there will be repression does not mean that we should stop. If anything, in terms of our analysis of trying to construct socialism, build socialist forces, and move towards a transformation society, if we have a scientific perspective, then the fact that there is a repression occurring is, in fact, at the very least, to some degree, a recognition of the growing and advancing power of socialism. This is something that has that cuts both ways. On the one hand, it does constrain options that used to be more easily available, and this can manifest in many multitude of ways, whether it be lawfare with respect to trying to target organizations to remove their tax-exempt status, trying to claim that they're not nonprofits, or say trying to remove lawsuits in court, as well as debanking, trying to eliminate means in which trying to gather funds. But as John mentioned, the fact of the matter is this is far beyond than just simply one individual. It's the reality is, to the question from earlier, ultimately, for better or for worse, the membership of DSA are just ordinary Americans, and that has like an extraordinary range of contradictions and positions and ideologies, right? But what you see come out is, in fact, it is succeeding despite some of the issues that we've described. And I think this has more to do with the organic increase in class consciousness within the United States. How this manifests and how we will respond is up to us, right? We are in uncharted territory in multitude of ways. You're, I think, right, Nick, that although DSA is the most recognizable socialist org, there are other ones. And in fact, my own position is maybe a fringe minority one, in that I don't actually believe that there is a vanguard party in the United States. Even though I'm the national leader of a social organization, I believe that terminology is very specific and very specific. I believe that we live in a pre-Leninist period where the advanced sections of the working class are still bubbling up and are still raising the class consciousness is still raising. The amount of political consciousness in this country has raised enormously in the past 10 years. But that is not the same thing as class consciousness. Class consciousness requires a class intentionally to engage in politics for itself and is aware that it's doing so. And I think what we're seeing in this moment is the transition from a political conscious working class to a class conscious working class. Because while there has been an enormous amount of increase in support for progressive electeds as well as DSA campaigns, this is not the same thing as class consciousness. And it's unclear what lies ahead of us, but what is clear is that we must get tougher, and if we can't get tough, then we must find tougher people.
The only thing I'll add to that is there's plenty of reasons to be scared, right? There's no shortage of reasons to be scared at any point by virtue of living in the United States and being an activist. But I don't know if it was, I think being undocumented for so long, I'm just personally, I certainly got to the point where I just stopped being scared, right? What is this energy? What is this? It seems at times like a wasted emotion. You can be careful, right? And do what you got to do. But being fearful, for me, just seems like a waste of energy. And I decided to stop feeling that way many, many years ago.
Wow, that was the shortest answer, and it was probably, definitely really powerful. Like in terms of just rejecting that what can seem like paralyzing fear, it facing this really really terrible moment of danger. We have some questions in the chat. I just kind of starred 3 of them, if you don't mind sticking around for a little bit and answering them. But we have one from Norman Espino, I think is the name. And the question is, what is the DSA? What community outreach and educational efforts are being conducted with Spanish-speaking communities, including immigrants, families, and young people?
I could take this. Unfortunately, it's limited, and it's intimately connected with what was mentioned before in terms of the membership composition. And ultimately, for us to be able to engage in community outreach in communities that speak Spanish, especially Latinos, it requires a membership as well as cadre that is fluent and able to communicate in Spanish. And this is unfortunately something that is lacking in our organization. I'm not glad that necessarily that this is the case. This is something that is a weak point among many weak points, but this is the fact of the matter. Maybe Luisa can speak more to this, but this is my analysis.
Yeah, I do immigrant justice organizing all the time, so I don't think that I would say the same thing. Recently, through the International Committee, we did a joint webinar series. It was 2 webinars with El Instituto de Formación Política. It was Morena, the ruling party in Mexico, Sheinbaum's party, basically their poly-ed branch. And so that was in English and Spanish. So we've, and those are, we have a language justice group that does lessons in English and Spanish, right? And they meet, I think, once a week. And so things are changing. We also pass a language justice resolution at convention, urging, really encouraging chapters to produce bilingual literature and stuff like that. So I think by virtue of the material conditions in the United States, that is having to change. And I think every month we're doing more and more in terms of that. So, but I mean, if you're listening right now and this is something that you're passionate about and you do speak Spanish or any other language, Haitian, Creole, Portuguese, whatever, we really encourage you to join DSA, especially if you are very much on the same page with everything else that we've said throughout this conversation. We need more, I don't want to say ultras. We need people who have these perspectives in the organization, if only to make sure that, anti-Zionist resolution continues to be supported, right? That we see through all the things, the fight fascist, the fuck ICE resolution, right? Make sure that all that organizing actually happens.
Yeah, thanks for those answers. I think that's a good, just kind of two thoughts on that. One is like you guys are a volunteer organization, so you're doing as much as you can. And I think the question that Norman had was actually also an offer to do Spanish interpretation for things like that. So I think the research, I put some links in the chat. So Norman, if you're listening or still on, you can follow those to get involved and to connect with folks as well. So the other question is, hold on, let me pull this up. The other question is, this is a question about the anti-Zionism policy, just kind of asking for clarification about like what's the standard for anti-Zionism in terms of the resolution and how it would be applied. And I think Jorge was kind of talking about this a little bit in theory, but if anyone wants to take a stab at that.
I have it right in front of me, so I can go ahead and not read from it too much, but DSA candidates, so we say that DSA candidates support the BDS movement, refrain from any and all affiliation from the Israeli government or Zionist lobby groups, and pledge to oppose legislation that harms Palestinians and support legislation that supports Palestinian liberation by affirming that these commitments, as detailed in this resolution, must hold true for all candidates. So, BDS, their position on Palestine would be part of the the candidate questionnaire. And it's not even like that there's I think criticisms that are unfair about like, oh, you can't condemn Hamas. It's like people have been condemning Hamas. This is not about condemning fucking Hamas. You could still do that. And it doesn't even immediately kick you out if you do violate it, right? That, just like progressive discipline in a labor contract, that candidate is given the opportunity to meet with organizers who've done Palestine liberation work and to be educated on why, why their position is so harmful. And so, like I said, I'll speak personally, I don't think that that's a particularly Gracie standard to hold anybody to. And I don't think that it will mean, there'll be immediate purchase of endorsed candidates or anything like that. I think we've drawn our line in the sand, and we've drawn it on a very good cause.
Excellent. Just the last question here. I think this is a good question because it kind of speaks to some of the work in the IC, and I guess like it says is the DSA socialism in the DSA is informed by is the socialism DSA is informed by a Western socialism or outside the West per the analysis of Gabriel Rockhill. This is kind of, Gabriel Rockhill, we've had him on the show. He's kind of critical of this notion of Western Marxism. But I really think this kind of question is kind of asking about, are there, typically there's a faction, not just within the DSA, but other sort of progressive factions look to like the Nordic model as like an example of like social democracy in the United States. Whereas, others might look to the more kind of popular mass-based socialism of like Latin America or, state socialism in China or things like that. So yeah, I guess just to kind of clarify that question in terms of examples.
I could take this. I think, I know Gabriel, and I think a lot of his analysis of the Western Marxism is an important intervention and must be thought through in terms of why is it that certain positions and certain ideas exist in the West, the West that is the block of nations that is inflicting imperialism on a world scale. And so basically those who, and I think we have to also think about what do we mean by socialism, right? And these are the fundamental questions, and there are different answers. One of these questions is the idea of there being a principal contradiction, being that the fundamental issue in society. And from my position, there is a fundamental contradiction, which is U.S.-led world imperialism. And that, of course, will lead to the answers to try to resolve that will come from places perhaps outside of the West. And I think we have to think about that. For me, like democratic socialism means like Hugo Chavez, right? It can mean Morena. It could mean, frankly, it could even mean like Marxist-Leninist parties. But people have to start thinking about what is democracy, what is socialism, and I think others can speak to this as well. But I think it's really what these terms have various different meanings. For myself, I'm a communist, so.
Yeah. I'll hop in because I know Luisa's going to close us out strong. I'll say, she's like, yeah. I'll say, yeah. Like, just a bit on what Jorge just said. Like, I'm a Marxist-Leninist, right? Like, I'm a member of Red Star. That's what we stand by, scientific socialism. I'll say that, like, for me, definitely, like, Marta Harnacker is somebody who influences a lot of the type of thought that I like to look into, especially with her thoughts on protagonism, her participation in a lot of, like, Latin American socialist governments, other things of that nature, too. I'd also cite quite a bit of, like, like the thought process and philosophy of, like, Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, Amilcar Cabral, Kwame Nkrumah, right? Like a lot of the ideas around neocolonialism. I'd also throw in, of course, especially Jim Foreman's bit on like indigenous leadership, how those things expand outwards, those organizing strategies and tactics. So I'd say that like those are all things that like can undergird like my specific orientation, which gets back to what I mentioned before of like how like these things where we come from, where we look at how we examine the world, are the things that kind of develop from it. And it's like, I don't think that like, for me, there was ever a point where I wanted to stop at Nordic or European social democracy. It just didn't, it was never a conceptualization where like, it just made sense to me, right? Like I just got back from DSA's Cuba delegation. It was amazing being in a society steeped in solidarity, right? Like steeped in solidarity, doing so much for the world, doing so much for the planet, right? And to come back here and then see all the things that they were doing, even underneath the blockade for the rest of the planet, right? And then come back here and see how like you can just and see how like imperialism is just choking them, and it's like you can see this playing out across the entire planet, right? And so it's like when you think about this idea of like what type of like Marxism or socialism or things that I would align around, the last thing I'll close with is that I think back to a specific letter where Socialist X Marx about like, how does all of your theory, all of your examinations are about Europe, right? Like, how do I apply these things? How do I examine it? And the point was to examine the relationships that were identified and then apply those to your conditions, examine your history, examine your political economy, examine the resources, examine the material in your area, and then develop your own conceptualization of that from there, right? Like where we get like, I think like I read a lot of Maoist thought. I read a lot of Ho Chi Minh thought, right? Shout out Luna Oy. I read a lot of Castro's thought, right? Like thinking about these things, examining it and trying to think through how we conceptualize that here is one of the things that I try to like expand well beyond. Because if we stop at a point of like just reforming capitalism, slapping some nice bunny ears on it or something else, or like slapping some rainbows or making it diverse, or doing some black capitalism, right? It's just going to still be predisposed on suppressing and containing and consuming the rest of the planet. And we can't have that.
And my answer to that is honestly, I don't know. We're a pretty new organization. DSA has origins from like the 1980s, and I don't know. It's a very different organization now than the way that it from the people who formed it. And so I was having a conversation once in Chile. A friend of mine asked me like, how long have you guys have had a membership that's been more than like 10,000 people? And I said, well, I don't know, maybe about 5 or 6 years. He's like, okay, how long have you had full-time co-chairs, right? Like full-time spokespeople for the organization. I said, well, at that point it was 2 years. He's like, okay, so your organization is about 2 years old. And I said, yeah, I think that's fair, right? In terms of being a real organization, we just passed for the first time electoral standards. That just happened. So whatever the age of DSA is on paper, I would say in practice, it's actually very, very young. And so broadly, I think in terms of the conversations that I have with my comrades, typically those who are white, identify with like the legacy of the Soviet Union, not in terms of all the decisions that were made, but in terms of like of a vision of socialism, at least at one point, that they identified with, right? And so that is at odds with people like me and John and Jorge, right? Because we very much see socialist movements as living, right? As living socialist projects that we can learn from, right? From Cuba, Venezuela, China, different countries and parties and stuff like that. And so sometimes those two things are at odds, right? When you're talking to somebody whose vision of socialism died many years ago. But I will say, right, being positive is that, again, we're a young organization and all of this is, to be written and to be decided, right? Like we have 90,000 people more or less, but like we don't really, it's hard to point to, we have this institutional power. You know what I mean? Because like I said, we just passed the goddamn electoral standards. So I think all of this is yet to be written. And again, anybody listening to this, I'm being a good board member and asking you to join DSA because everybody has a role in forming it, right? And these decisions are not made, they are oftentimes made on a dime, right? Like we are seeing with pushing back against the repression against immigrants. When we see, like, for instance, when it comes to presidential elections, like a lot of these times decisions are made in the moment and it's reflective of who's a member in the organization. But like I said, everybody has the opportunity to shape this answer, particularly in the future.
Excellent pitch and way to sort of end this conversation, Luisa. And I have my own recommendations. One, I don't call myself a tanky just because we don't have tanks. It doesn't make any sense. It makes sense if we had like tanks, but it also kind of gets to your point about like the Soviet Union. It's like we don't have tanks anymore. Wish we did, but we don't. That's about state power. And then also ultras. I thought there was a really funny comment by somebody named Colin in there, and they were like, they said, when I hear ultra, I think of ultra Michelob Ultra, which is like a really, really, really light beer. So maybe we can call ourselves Diesel or something like that. I'm just kidding. That's a joke. But also, yeah, I think that just kind of like to pick up on your point, in terms of, this isn't just like about, I think sometimes people, there's a lot of people who are extremely online and they may be not getting this kind of information in their unions. They may not be getting this kind of information in whatever community space that they're in. And so they typically turn to online stuff. And sometimes it can be overwhelming because there's all these kind of, as you all kind of pointed out, there's all these kind of like histories and genealogies. But I think what's most important is not so much, find your history and your genealogy and like find what actually like resonates with you. But, this isn't like shopping for a brand of laundry detergent, right? You actually have to be part of the process. You have to join. It's not just a decision or a brand or sort of an individual choice. It's a collective process, as you said. And whether you join the DSA or another organization, it's about joining an organization and being part of that conversation, being part of that struggle. So I really appreciate the way that you all have taken care to answer these questions. There are always going to be, points of disagreement and contention, but also I think what you're pointing to is sort of a broader sort of consensus that's building within DSA. And I would also just put that in terms of the larger kind of left, anti-capitalist, socialist, anti-imperialist movement in the United States. And it's only going to get bigger if we keep pushing. And like you said, we can't be afraid. We don't have, we just really don't have that luxury right now. So before I let you all go, if you want to just talk about where people can find the work that you're doing, if there's a project that you want to uplift in the DSA, like a link that people can go to and check out some more information, I'll just turn it over to you. I'll give you guys the last word in that regard. So we'll start with you, Luisa, since you're already spotlighted.
Oh, okay. I love the IC, the International Committee within DSA. I think that we do a lot of good work, and I still continue to do work within the IC despite being on the national leadership. So I encourage everybody to, to check us out there. I'm also part of a caucus called 21st Century Socialism Caucus, and we do, we've been doing stuff recently on Venezuela. And so, but those are not just, DSA has a lot of basically anything that you're interested in. We have some sort of coordination or working group on committee, housing, immigrant justice, electoralism, though that's probably not your audience. But the thing is that there is practically a menu of options, in terms of organizing. And that's part of what I think drives our success as an organization, because it's not just focused on electoralism. Electoralism is one pole of the DSA branch, the DSA tent, so to speak. So whatever you're interested, you can pretty much find it there.
John, I think you're muted.
Okay, I'll hop in next. I'll say, building on what Luisa just mentioned there, just in kind of what we've been saying across this entire discussion, is that this organization and where it goes next is made up of the people who join it, the people who build it, and the people who struggle within it. And so a key thing with it is that there is a tendency for you in the organization. I would definitely encourage people who are more internationalist, more anti-imperialist, and more clearly socialist and communist to join directly. But I would say specifically, the organization is exactly what we build it to be. I'd also shout out our mutual aid working group and a couple other bodies that I want to say that people should absolutely get involved in that are also springing back up. We're definitely going to need more survival programs, more solidarity activities, and more solidarity actions in this moment in time too. I'd also definitely suggest people consider signing up for our National Political Education Committee, get some socialist night schools going, doing more recruitment. We currently have a mass recruitment and retention drive going right now where we're trying to essentially get more members in, but also kind of develop them into cadre and get them to stick around, just like Jorge mentioned earlier. But I would say again, just like Luisa mentioned, the DSA is kind of going through the process of we're lacing up our shoes and we're getting ready to run. But the key thing is that the process of us forming into that thing, what it is, how we exist, how we operate, it comes from us.
Yeah, and just to add in as well, if people wish to join DSA, the link is dsausa.org/join. And for joining the International Committee, similarly, you do dsaic.org/join. And to myself, I also am a member of a caucus. It's called DSA Merge. It is a multi-tendency communist formation of which the primary struggles that have united the forces within it have been anti-imperialism, as well as abolitionist, localist, and community organizing.
Excellent, comrades. Well, thanks again for joining us. Just a reminder to those of you who are listening, Red Media is hiring. We are looking for a new executive director. You can check out our website, redmedia.press, if you think you want to apply. Or if you know somebody who might be good for the job descriptions are there. Thank you all for joining. Thanks for our listeners for their kind support and the questions. We really appreciate everyone taking the time today. So until next time.